my name is Emily Foster, and at 18, my mom accused me of hitting my brother. But 2 years later, his stealing finally exposed his lies, and my dad confessed he knew I was innocent. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. I had already learned the hard way that family could be a cage disguised as care. Ridgeway Youth Recovery Center wasn't a home. It was a prison painted with pastel walls where smiles were rationed, and the quiet was more dangerous than yelling. The first morning, I learned quickly that silence was armor. The counselors spoke of recovery and truth-telling, but their voices were soft nets designed to catch confessions they could manipulate. I kept my own truths close, jotting them into a tiny notebook beneath my mattress. Facts, not feelings. Facts didn't lie. Other girls filled the room with their whispers and sideways glances. They each carried stories I wasn't ready to hear, tangled like their hair in the morning rush. I stayed apart, observing, cataloging. Then I noticed Jacob, tall with sharp eyes, who seemed to sense that I didn't belong but wouldn't be broken easily. The first week, Ridgeway drilled the routines into us. Breakfast at 7, check-in at 8, talk, therapy sessions that stretched into loops of repeating in the same lines until they became rote. "Tell me how you feel about what happened," Miss Denning said, pencil poised. I spoke only in detached sentences, describing events without assigning blame, without emotion. They nodded, approved, misread. Even in these small acts, I learned power, the quiet defiance of not giving them the words they wanted. Jacob noticed during one of the silent lunch hours. He leaned over and whispered, "You write everything down. Smart. Most people here spill themselves too fast." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The nights were the worst. Locked doors, the low hum of heaters, girls crying softly, some screaming into pillows. I scribbled. I wrote observations, behaviors, things that were real and couldn't be twisted against me. I refused to cry. I refused to confess to crimes I didn't commit. I thought about my parents, about Matthew, about how my innocence had been questioned for years, how lies had been spun that sent me here. The memory of that first accusation was sharp. How Mom's voice cracked, how Dad stayed silent, how the world they painted for themselves blamed me. 2 weeks in, I realized Ridgeway wasn't meant to heal me. It was meant to perfect me into someone who could be controlled. I could play along, but my notebook stayed secret. I could act like the compliant Emily they wanted, nod, speak the right words, but inside I remained untouchable. Jacob became my quiet ally, his humor slicing through the oppressive atmosphere. Carlos, another boy, scribbled letters nightly to his little sister. They were my reminders that some humanity survived here, hidden under layers of manipulation. I began to understand survival meant observation, silence, and small acts of resistance. By the end of the first month, I had mapped the social terrain. I knew who would snitch, who would manipulate, who would crumble under pressure. I knew the counselors' scripts by heart, their patterns, their weak spots. Knowledge became my weapon. One evening, I overheard Miss Denning discussing my case with another counselor. "She's quiet," they said, "but that's the dangerous kind. She's calculating." I smiled faintly. Finally, someone recognized the truth. I wasn't broken. I was awake, and I planned. I planned for the day I would leave. I planned for Matthew to know the truth, for Mom and Dad to understand that the story they told the world wasn't mine. But first, I had to survive Ridgeway, play their game, and keep my secrets intact. By the time my release date neared, I had become a ghost within the walls. I said what was necessary, nodded when prompted, and never faltered. And through it all, my notebook grew fat with truths, with observations, with the reality of who I was and who my family really was. When the day finally came, I walked out of Ridgeway, feeling the weight of years lifted, but the tension of the past still lingering. Outside, the air felt different, freer, heavier, real, and for the first time, I felt the taste of control in my own hands. Freedom outside Ridgeway was strange. The streets didn't have schedules or locked doors, but neither did they offer safety. My parents had moved on or pretended to. But I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of their lives. Not yet. Not until I had my story straight, my truths unassailable. The first call I made was to Jacob. He sounded relieved, almost surprised. "I thought you'd disappear," he said. I smiled faintly into the phone. I almost did, but some stories demand witnesses. I found a small apartment not far from town, furnished minimally with space to breathe. Every item had purpose: a bed, a desk, shelves for my notebooks. Everything else was secondary. I unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet, measuring the distance between me and Ridgway's walls. Then came the first confrontation. Mom called, her voice soft, trembling. "Emily, we've been worried." I laughed softly, bitterly. "Worried or worried about how your lies would catch up to you?" She stuttered, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the woman who had once been my mother, now broken beneath the weight of her own choices. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let silence stretch, the long pause a mirror to the years of ignored truth. "I've been fine," I said finally, careful, measured. "Better than fine, stronger." I could hear her inhale sharply. She wanted me to apologize, to beg, to forgive. I offered none of it. Jacob came over the next evening. We sat on my threadbare couch, sharing leftovers and half-forgotten stories. "You've changed," he said, eyes scanning my face. I nodded. I had to, or I wouldn't have left Ridgway alive in more than just body. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Every move I made, every word I spoke had weight. I had learned to observe, to calculate, to wield silence like a blade. Ridgway taught me that. Now the world outside would learn it, too. Weeks passed. The calls from my parents became more desperate, veiled threats and pleading wrapped into one. I read each, carefully cataloged them in my notebook. I didn't respond to every message, only the ones that mattered, the ones that revealed intentions. Then came the news about Matthew. My younger brother, the one they had used to manipulate me, had been caught in a lie of his own. Something petty at first. Stealing from a neighbor, but the pattern was the same. The family preferred his lies over my truth. I felt a bitter satisfaction. Not revenge, not yet, but the scales had begun to tip. I met with him later, alone in a small cafe. He looked different, humbled perhaps, or just scared. "Emily, I began, but I raised a hand. "Save it. I know what happened. I know what you've done, and I know what they told you to do." His face fell, eyes wide. "You're not angry." I shook my head. "I'm done being manipulated. I'm done being silenced. This isn't about anger anymore. It's about clarity, about truth." The next weeks were quiet but tense. Mom and Dad tried everything. Guilt, flattery, threats veiled as concern. I responded only when necessary, always measured, always watching. Ridgway's lessons were still my shield. Every glance, every tone, every word was a piece of the puzzle. Jacob stayed by my side, a silent anchor. One night, as we walked home from a diner, he asked softly, "Do you ever feel like letting it all out?" I paused. Sometimes, I admitted, but then I remember who's listening, who's waiting for me to slip. He nodded. "You'll get there, but when you do, you'll do it your way, and that's what I planned. Not for vengeance, not for drama, but for truth. For the day when every lie, every twisted accusation, every manipulation would crumble under the weight of facts I had recorded, of actions I had measured, of the person I had become. I wasn't just Emily Foster, the quiet, observant girl from Ridgway. I was Emily Foster, survivor, strategist, and soon witness to the truth that would shake the family I had once called home. The first confrontation wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost clinical. Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Emily, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside before I could respond. I let her. Sitting calmly at my desk, notebook open, pen ready. "I don't have time for games," she began, voice trembling. "Your father and I, we just want what's best for you." I tilted my head. "You've had your chance at best." I said, "It ruined years of my life. I don't want your version anymore." She flinched. That's when I saw it. Something real breaking through. The carefully constructed facade of control was slipping. I pressed on. "Do you remember the day you sent me away? Do you remember the lies you told, the stories you twisted, the way you painted me as the problem?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Emily, it wasn't like that. I cut her off. Don't. I've documented everything. Every call, every accusation, every manipulated moment. Your guilt isn't mine to soothe. Your stories aren't mine to believe. I am not a character in your drama anymore. I am a witness to the truth. Dad arrived minutes later looking angry and confused. "What's going on?" he demanded. I handed him a copy of my notebook, carefully annotated. "This," I said, "this is what years of silence look like. Read it and you'll see why I left. Read it and you'll understand why I'm not coming back." They read in silence, the apartment heavy with years of tension. I watched them crumble, not physically, not dramatically, but subtly, internally. Every line of text was a reminder of the choices they had made, the manipulation they had relied on, and the child they had underestimated. Then came Matthew. I had called him earlier, invited him to see me alone. He hesitated, guilty, wary, but curiosity won. He arrived quietly, standing near the doorway. "Emily, I didn't know it was this bad," he murmured. I looked at him steadily. "It was, and you were part of it. But now it's different. You can't hide behind them anymore. Not from me, not from yourself." He nodded, swallowed hard, and for the first time I saw him as an equal. Not the manipulated child, but someone facing consequences. I'm sorry," he said simply. No excuses, no deflection. That small acknowledgement was enough to make the air feel lighter, the truth beginning to settle. The real shift came when I took control of my own narrative. I started reaching out to people who had been silent witnesses for years, neighbors, friends, distant relatives. Their stories aligned, corroborated, and gave shape to my experience. I wasn't alone in this. Ridgway might have tried to silence me. My family might have tried to discredit me, but the world outside was listening. Jacob stayed close, helping me organize the evidence, helping me stay grounded. We spent long nights comparing notes, tracing patterns, and piecing together the timeline of manipulation. Every detail mattered. Every moment was a step toward clarity. Then the turning point, a family gathering intended by Mom and Dad to make amends. I attended carefully, intentionally. I entered not as a frightened child, not as a silenced daughter, but as someone who held the power of truth. Eyes met mine across the room, some wary, some defiant. I didn't flinch. "I'm here," I announced quietly, so that only those who mattered could hear. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to speak and to be heard. They tried to redirect, to minimize, to charm, but it was futile. Every word I spoke carried weight. Every fact, every diary entry, every corroboration from witnesses anchored me firmly in reality. Mom's face fell as she realized her narratives were unraveling. Dad's posture stiffened, defensive, but the rigidity couldn't mask the realization. The child they tried to silence was no longer powerless. Matthew, standing beside me, finally understood the gravity of the truth. No excuses could shield them now. The confrontation wasn't explosive. It was quieter, more devastating because it was factual. They couldn't argue with evidence. They couldn't rewrite history. Ridgway had tried to teach me survival. My family had tried to teach me obedience. And I had survived. I had observed. I had recorded, and now I was free. After that day, life outside Ridgway took on a new rhythm. I rebuilt connections, strengthened bonds, and embraced the small joys of independence. Every call, every encounter, every shadow from the past was measured, analyzed, and navigated with clarity. Jacob and I grew closer, not just as allies, but as confidants. Our relationship wasn't defined by Ridgway, by my family, or by the chaos behind us. It was defined by the present, by shared understanding, and by the unspoken acknowledgement that survival had forged something stronger than ordinary bonds. And yet the memory lingered. Ridgway, my parents, the silenced years. They weren't gone, but they were contained. They had power only as long as I allowed it. Now the power was mine. I could write, speak, and live my truth, not in fear, not in doubt, but with the knowledge that I had endured, observed, and emerged whole. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just leaving the cage. It was reclaiming your voice, your agency, and your story. Ridgway had shaped me, my family had tested me, and the world had witnessed me. And now at 18, I was finally, undeniably Emily Foster. The weeks after that family confrontation were a strange blend of relief and vigilance. Relief because the air felt lighter because the truth had been spoken and heard. Vigilance because I knew old patterns die hard. My parents were capable of manipulation, subtle or otherwise, and I wouldn't give them the chance to resume control. I started reclaiming pieces of my life I had long suppressed. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during my years of silence. Each meeting was a careful negotiation. I shared what I chose to, observed reactions, and tested boundaries. Some people were shocked by my story, some skeptical, but most simply listened, and that listening was powerful. It confirmed that my voice mattered outside the walls of Ridgeway or my family's house. Jacob became more than a helper. He became my anchor. We spent long evenings sifting through old memories, laughing over trivial things, and supporting each other through darker recollections. There were nights when the weight of the past threatened to suffocate me, and Jacob's presence reminded me I didn't have to face it alone. He didn't pity me, didn't infantilize me. He treated me as an equal, as someone capable of handling the truth. That respect above all became my compass. Then came the final test, Mom's attempt to regain influence. She called ostensibly to check in, but I sensed the undertone immediately. "Emily, we just want to make things right," she said, her voice syrupy with false warmth. I listened carefully, then replied calm but firm, "Mom, your version of making things right isn't welcome. If you want to interact with me, it will be on terms I set, not yours. No lies, no manipulation, no guilt tripping." There was a pause on the line, and I felt a small thrill of power. She realized in that moment that I was no longer the child she could bend. I see," she muttered before hanging up abruptly. I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. My family had a long history of persistence, of bending reality to suit themselves, but I also knew the difference now. Persistence without truth held no weight against someone who knew their own story inside out. With my parents' influence diminished, I began focusing on my own aspirations. I enrolled in a local college program, balancing part-time work with studies, and gradually rebuilt financial independence. Every paycheck, every successful class, every small achievement was a declaration. I existed not as a reflection of their expectations, but as my own person. One evening, as I sat in my tiny apartment reviewing notes from Ridgeway and my family files, a strange sense of completion washed over me. The anger and frustration hadn't vanished, but they no longer dominated my mind. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction, an understanding that endurance and observation had their rewards. I was free not just from Ridgeway, not just from my family's manipulations, but from the fear that had haunted me for years. Jacob joined me, sitting across the table, and for the first time I spoke of the future, not in terms of defense, but possibility. What if we started a project? I suggested something to help other kids like me, not just to expose the system, but to give them tools, support, and a voice. He smiled, eyes bright. "I think that's brilliant. You'd be amazing at it, and I'll be right there with you." Plans formed quickly. We outlined mentorship programs, awareness campaigns, and resources for young people silenced or controlled by authority figures or family dynamics. It wasn't just activism, it was healing for ourselves and for others. The past was no longer a cage, it was a foundation on which we could build. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. I received a letter from a distant relative who had always suspected something was wrong, but had never spoken up. In careful handwriting, they admitted regret for not intervening sooner and expressed pride in my courage. The acknowledgement wasn't just comforting, it validated every step I had taken to reclaim my narrative. Emily Foster, 18, finally felt whole, not because the past had been erased, but because I had mastered it, faced it, and converted its lessons into strength. Ridgeway and my family had shaped me, tested me, and tried to silence me, but they hadn't broken me. And as I looked at Jacob, at the life we were building together, at the plans we were sketching for others, I realized something profound. Freedom wasn't a destination, It was a daily act of assertion, a conscious choice to live in truth, courage, and awareness, and for the first time in my life, I chose it willingly, without fear, without compromise. The shadows of my past would always linger, subtle reminders of what I had endured, but the light I carried now, my voice, my agency, my story was stronger. I was no longer a victim of circumstances, a pawn in manipulative games, or a silenced child. I was Emily Foster, witness, survivor, advocate, and my story finally belonged entirely to me. The following months marked a new chapter, one I could call my own without hesitation. College routines, part-time work, and our mentorship project filled most days, but evenings often brought quiet reflection. I would sit by the window, notebook open, letting memories surface, not as chains, but as reminders of how far I had come. Mom and Dad tried reaching out sporadically, each attempt clumsy, each message heavy with implication. I responded only when necessary, firmly, without emotion, a shield that they could not penetrate. Over time, their calls became less frequent. Perhaps they sensed the futility of control. Perhaps they realized that the Emily they thought they knew no longer existed. Jacob remained a steadfast presence. We navigated the labyrinth of our shared past using humor, honesty, and occasional quiet solidarity to keep each other grounded. His own experiences, struggles with family and personal setbacks intertwined with mine, forming a foundation of trust neither of us had known before. We were partners in every sense, allies, confidants, and increasingly a surrogate family for each other. Our mentorship initiative gained traction. Teens who had faced similar silencing, manipulation, or institutional neglect began to reach out. They told their stories in tentative bursts at first, then with growing confidence. We listened, guided, and validated. The work was exhausting, emotionally draining at times, but every story affirmed the importance of reclaiming one's voice. It was healing, not just for them, but for me. One evening, a particularly touching message arrived from a girl who had been in Ridgeway around the same time I was. She wrote about feeling seen for the first time, about understanding that she wasn't broken, only unheard. Tears blurred my vision as I shared the note with Jacob. "This," I whispered, "is why we do it. This is why it matters." By spring, I felt a confidence I had never experienced. My finances were stable. My studies were on track. And the mentorship program had secured modest funding enough to expand our outreach. Each success reinforced a simple truth. Control over one's narrative was the most potent form of freedom. Eventually, even the specter of my parents felt diminished. News reached me through distant relatives, vague reports, and occasional social media that they were unsettled, perhaps ashamed of their inability to manipulate me. I felt no triumph in their discomfort, only a quiet recognition that I had broken the cycle. Their influence, once omnipresent, was now inconsequential. The final, most personal transformation came in understanding my own identity. Emily Foster was no longer defined by abuse, silencing, or institutional oversight. I was a student, an advocate, a storyteller, a survivor. My voice was steady, my choices deliberate, my vision forward, looking. I had earned through endurance and reflection a life of integrity and autonomy. One evening, Jacob and I celebrated a small milestone, the first successful mentorship workshop outside our immediate circle. The room buzzed with young voices, each carrying its own struggle, each radiating potential. Watching them speak, I realized the full circle of my journey from silent observer to cautious participant to empowered mentor. The girl I had once been caged, silenced, fearful, had grown into someone who could guide others through darkness. As we left the venue, the night air crisp against our faces, Jacob grinned. "You've changed so many lives, Emily, including mine." I smiled back, a quiet warmth in my chest. We did it together, and as I looked at the city lights shimmering in the distance, I knew it wasn't an ending. It was an ongoing act of speaking, of witnessing, of reclaiming. Every choice I made, every word I spoke, every story I amplified became a testament to the life I had fought to claim. No longer defined by Ridgeway, no longer constrained by my parents' lies, Emily Foster finally lived fully, courageously, and unapologetically. The past was present, yes, but it was no longer a cage. It was a foundation, a teacher, and a silent witness to the woman I had become. Freedom wasn't something given. It was something seized, nurtured, and defended, and I intended to defend it every day in every story I told, in every life I touched for the rest of my